Paul.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
There's been a great deal of gnashing of teeth and wringing of hands and, dozens and dozens of senators saying that the president shouldn't have met with President Putin. And I guess I wonder because if somehow we've become a little bit sidetracked by partisanship, because in the past, President Obama met with President Putin, President George Bush met with Putin. And I guess the question I have is whether or not we're entering into sort of a naive time where we think unless someone is a perfect Jeffersonian Democrat, we're not going to meet with them. We also have people saying, well, he should have shook his fist at him and he should have called him a murderer and a thug. Do you think that there's a possibility that we can have a relationship where we criticize the human rights records of other countries, but still also sit down and attempt to have diplomacy and at least channels so we don't escalate things? Do you think that it was a right idea for President Trump to meet with President Putin?
I think you asked two questions, and it's yes to each of them. I think we can accomplish that. I think we can meet with less than perfect citizens of the world and hopefully move the ball in the right direction. Second, I think it was more than appropriate that President Trump meet with Vladimir Putin.
And my own personal opinion is I think we need to de-escalate some of the partisan tensions in our country and try to look towards ways that we can have discussions with foreign leaders and not be so simplistic that somehow they have to have a perfect record or that we have to shout and scream. I mean, I think back to Reagan talking to Gorbachev. He said tear down that wall. He called him an evil empire. But I just don't imagine Reagan sitting down with Gorbachev and yelling and screaming and shaking his fist and saying murderer, thug, and reciting the Stalin's human rights abuses. So I think there is a difference for anybody who's ever thought about this between sitting down and how diplomacy would occur between individuals and reciting a litany of human rights abuses. In that vein, I think there seems to be sort of a limitless appetite for more sanctions, but maybe insufficient interest in describing what actions are needed to remove sanctions. And so Senator Rubio mentioned this Deter Act. I guess my concern with some of this is that the definition of who might be meddling in an election in our country is not limited just to Russia. It could include even allies who spend money on social media somehow in our country. It doesn't seem to differentiate between social media and actually hacking into our electoral system and changing thousands of votes. It also takes the power away from the president and gives it to the Director of National Intelligence. This is the Deter Act we were talking about. And I know you indicated that, well, sanctions are probably a good idea to deter them. But do you think it's a good idea to take the sanction power, give it to the DNI, and then the sanctions have to remain in place for 8 hours with the president not having any ability to decide whether there's been some kind of change in behavior by the malefactors?
Senator, without having seen the legislation, I do not think that's a good idea.
I liked in your statement where you said that President Trump believes that now is the time for direct communication in our relationship in order to make clear to President Putin that there is the possibility to reverse the negative course of our relationship. And I think that gets at the heart of why we have these discussions. So if you heap sanctions on and Congress puts them on and they have to stay on for 8 years and they can never come off, if there is no off-ramp, if there is no discussion, that's sort of what diplomacy is supposed to be about. So I do commend you for talking to Kim. Are we here to extol Kim's record on human rights? Obviously not. But at the same time, for sanctions to have an effect, you have to have negotiation. So what I would say to my colleagues who've been all over TV saying there should not have been a meeting, think again. Just keep heaping these sanctions on, and you don't want any ability to talk to the adversary about how we would actually remove the sanctions if behavior changed. You've got to have communications, not to mention the fact that we have planes flying within a mile or within 100 yards of each other in Syria. We have to have open lines of communication. So what I would ask is that we try to de-escalate the partisanship in our country so we can once again be open to some kind of diplomacy. I have one question with regard to Iran, and you and I differ on the possibility of a further Iranian agreement. I think it's actually much more difficult, and I had my own criticisms of the nuclear agreement. I didn't think it was perfect, and yet I would have tried to have built upon it rather than destroy it. We had a lot of money at the time that was a carrot to try to bring Iran to the table. But now we have, instead of one issue, we have two, or instead of a smaller group of issues, we have a bigger group of issues. The nuclear issues are back on the table if we have to renegotiate the nuclear agreement, and the ballistic missile issue. And the point that I think that we need to think through in discussions with Iran is that I think Iran, from their perspective, would see getting rid of their ballistic missile program as basically unilateral surrender. It's not my viewpoint. I think it's what I believe to be their viewpoint. I think they also see Saudi Arabia as a great adversary, and I think they see Israel as a potential adversary. And so I don't think, unless, it'd be great if you got all three to come together and have a multilateral agreement on not developing nuclear weapons and not having ballistic missiles. I don't see the other two coming to the table, frankly, to do that. And so I think in moving forward, I think it's just important that you understand this isn't going to be easy. The first Iran agreement also was a multilateral agreement. You had multilateral sanctions. You now have more unilateral sanctions, and you're going to have a unilateral agreement that's sort of your own agreement. So I just think we shouldn't be so optimistic, and I guess I'd like to hear from you. How do you, what makes you believe that Iran will come to the table to discuss ballistic missiles?
Senator, I'm under no illusions about how important Iran views its ballistic missile program. I agree with you there. The question for President Trump faced was the JCPOA good enough? He concluded it wasn't remotely good enough. I think he said it was one of the worst deals in history. I don't want to get the language wrong. And so he concluded we would find ourselves in a better place with an opportunity to revisit all of these issues, the broad spectrum of issues, not just the nuclear portfolio, but the missile program, their malign activity around the world, all of them in a package. It did accept the understanding that there would be those that wouldn't come alongside of us. But you should know there is a coalition. It's not America and America alone. We have others who believe that this was the right decision too. The Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, other smaller European governments, not the E3 themselves. But there are a number of folks who are beginning to coalesce around an understanding of how we can appropriately respond to Iran to take down the nuclear risk to the United States as well as the risk from these other malign activities.
Thank you. Senator Udall.